Hi everyone, and welcome back to Biology 206. Today we're going to be moving on to our third and final portion of the biotic interactions unit. And we're going to be talking about mutualism and commensalism. My name is Dr. Jennifer Balzer, and let's get started. Okay, so this figure will look very familiar from our last lecture, but this is showing us, again, this sort of different combinations between species 1, species 2, and species 1 in terms of their interactions with one another. And today we're going to be focusing on those species by species interaction that are positive. So mutualism, where we have a positive, both species benefit from the interaction, and commensalism, where one species benefits and one species receives neither benefit nor detriment of the interaction. Okay, so mutualism, a mutually beneficial interaction between individuals of two or more species, so positive, positive. And commensalism, an interaction in which individuals of one species benefit while those of the other species neither benefit nor receive harm. So positive and neutral, okay? And so at this point we've then covered competition, amensalism, predation, herbivory, and parasitism. And today we're covering commensalism and mutualism, okay? So just to round out the terminology for this mutualism, commensalism unit, this positive interactions part, is the term facilitation. And so these are species interactions that benefit at least one participant. So you can think of that facilitation as a synonym for positive interactions, which is the term we used in the first slide. Okay, and this is a much more common term to hear in the literature. Symbiosis is the second important term, and this has a Greek language origin, so sym being together and biosis being living, so living together. And so this is a really close relationship between two species, so a relationship in which individuals of two species live in close physical and or physiological contact with each other. Here's a second definition that's a little bit different. Any type of close and long-term biological interaction between two different biological organisms, so two different species. Okay, and so this can include mutualism, so positive, positive, commensalism, positive, negative, or parasitism, because remember, we have a lot of parasites that are really intimately associated with their hosts, and in that case, we have a positive, negative interaction between those two individuals. Okay, and a really key thing is that these positive relationships, these facilitative relationships are ubiquitous in nature. We see them all over the place. One of the most widespread positive interactions is the relationship between plants and fungi, between mycorrhizal fungi and photosynthetic plants. And in this relationship, this is a very simplified version of what happens, but in this relationship, we have plants. Here we have a nice oak tree fixing carbon dioxide via photosynthesis. We have a fungus here that you see the fungal fruiting body, which is the mushroom that you see on the soil. And below ground is where all the action happens. This is where all the hyphae and fungal rooting structures are. And those hyphae are taking up nutrients from the soil, nutrients and water. And those hyphae are also connected to this tree. And so what happens is that we have between this mycorrhizal fungi and its host plant, we have an exchange of resources. So the plant provides carbon in exchange for water and mineral nutrients from the fungus. Okay, so these mycorrhizae benefit the plant by supporting their water and mineral nutrition needs, so soil resources. They can do this very effectively because the hyphae of mycorrhiza are much finer than even the finest roots on plants, and so they can access resources in different ways than plants, and they also have some mechanisms for accessing particularly nutrients that plants don't have that allow them to access different forms of nutrients. And so mycorrhizal partners can be really important, especially when you're in dry or low nutrient environments, and they can help to support those requirements And likewise, the fungi need carbon to produce structures, and the plant provides that to in exchange for these mineral nutrients and water. And so it's a resource sharing symbiosis. Okay. And here we have a figure. We also have this figure in our text. It's a Keller version, but I wanted to include this one because it actually shows you in the legend the types of mycorrhizal associations that are dominant in these different regions. And this shows all of the parts of the planet that have mycorrhizal partnerships, and you can see that it's pretty well the entire planet, okay? But that the types of mycorrhizal relationships you have in these different parts of the planet and these different biomes vary. So just as an example, up here in the tundra and the taiga region, we have predominantly ericoid mycorrhizae. These are a type of endomycorrhiza, we'll get into that in a moment, that form partnerships with ericoid plants. So blueberries and cranberries and these types of species that are really dominant in this environment. As you move into the intertropical regions, you tend to have arbuscular mycorrhiza, another type of endomycorrhiza being more dominant. And so you can see that mycorrhiza are ubiquitous across the planet, but the nature of those mycorrhizal partnerships and how intimately associated they are with plants and the types of plants that are hosting mycorrhiza change as the biogeography and the resource requirements in those areas change. Okay, so for those of you not familiar with mycorrhiza, it's a really intimate relationship that is formed between a fungus, the mycorrhizal fungal partner, and the plant. And this happens in the roots. And so here we have two main types of mycorrhiza. So ectomycorrhiza and just ecto being on the outside. Ectomycorrhiza form basically a sheath around the outside of the root, and you can see this here on this fine root, and also on these rooting structures. And so you have this sheath on the outside of the sheath or mantle, and so it's those hyphae that we were just seeing in that previous cartoony figure. Those hyphae form a sheath or a mantle on the outside of the root, and then send some hyphae into the root itself, but those hyphae only extend between cells, so they only occupy those intercellular spaces, okay? In contrast, arbuscular mycorrhiza or endomycorrhiza, this is the most common form of endomycorrhiza, but there are a number of other types of endomycorrhiza, including ericoid mycorrhiza and orchid mycorrhiza. This is a much more intimate relationship where you have the mycorrhizal fungus actually penetrating into the cells of the host plant and having direct contact with the cell membrane, okay? And so you have some hyphae that grow in between cells, in this case still, but then some that grow right into the cell, and so that relationship between the arbuscular mycorrhiza and its plant hosts are much more intimate. And there are special structures that you can notice. You can see these here, arbuscules that are really obvious when you stain the roots of arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. So what I want you to take home from this is the fact that there are different structures, different levels of intimacy of this relationship between plants and fungi. They all serve similar purposes. Different mycorrhizal fungi are good at kind of accessing better at accessing different resources. And there's an evolutionary story with all of this as well, with certain groups of mycorrhiza being more closely associated with certain taxa of plants as well. For example, the Pinaceae that we see in the boreal forests of North America, the pines and spruces and larches, they all have ectomycorrhizal associations. Okay, so we have some endomycorrhizal fungi that actually penetrate into the cells of the plant. We have ectomycorrhizal fungi that predominantly form a sheath and maybe extend a little in between cells. And then there's mycorrhizal fungi that kind of act somewhere in between the two, and they're called ectendomycorrhizal fungi. And these are kind of partway between endo and ectomycorrhiza, a little bit more of an intimate association than ectomycorrhiza, but a little bit less than arbuscular or endomycorrhiza. Okay, so mycorrhizal symbiosis is a great example of atrophic mutualism. And atrophic mutualism is where the mutualist receives energy or nutrients from its partner. And in both cases, for both partners in that plant-fungus interaction, there's an exchange of resources. Carbon coming from the plant to the fungus, nutrients and water going from the fungus to the plant. And so this exchange of resources, that's really critical. Another great example comes from the case study at the start of your chapter with these amazing leafcutter ants. And if any of you have had the opportunity to go down to Central or South America, these are all over the place and they're really quite incredible. You see them making short work of leaves. They go and they work together to snip these little pieces of leaves off and use their mighty ant strength to carry those huge pieces of leaves back to the nest, where they use these leaves to actually culture fungus. So they have basically fungal gardens in their nests. They provide these leaves to the fungi to provide the resources for those fungi. And in turn, they feed on the fungi for, the fungi provide a food resource for the ants. And so they're, in a sense, they're gardeners. Which is the way they're portrayed in your text. But the fungi rely on the ants for provision of the leaf biomass material that they break down to create more fungal bodies. And the ants rely on the fungi for food resources. And they tend these fungal gardens. So it's a really amazing symbiosis and another great example of atrophic mutualism. Okay, lots of other great examples of mutualisms that involve all kinds of different organisms. And some of these are different types of mutualisms, but we have our, classic clownfish. Everyone's familiar with the clownfish anemone relationship where the anemone provides protection. These are stinging cell. There are stinging cells on the anemone. The anemone provides protection for the clownfish from predators of the clownfish. The clownfish has a mucus layer on its body that protects it from those stinging cells of the anemone. In return, the anemone scares away predators of the clownfish scares away predators of the anemone. It provides nutrients to the anemone by from waste products from the fish, as well as from scraps of food that may fall down to the ocean bottom while the clownfish is eating. So another great example of a mutualism. Here we have another different type of example. I just want to kind of go through a little bit of the diversity of mutualisms because they're really incredible. This is the ant plant. This is one example of an ant plant mutualism. There are so many. And if you look up ant plants or myrmecophytic plants, there's just such a tremendous diversity of ant plant relationships. It's really incredible. But this one is especially neat. It's acacias in savanna ecosystems produce these long spines. You can see those there on this acacia tree. In addition, they produce nectaries that produce nectar for that are provided to the ants. Okay, so the acacias produce nectar that provides a food resource for the ants. They produce these big spines that the queen ant will hollow out and create nests within. So they provide habitat for the ants. They provide food for the ants. And in return, the ants do a huge service for the acacias by fending off pretty much anything that might bother those acacias. In this case, we see this browsing goat coming along and trying to nibble at the acacia, and you can actually see the ants swarming the face of the acacia. And I will tell you, having worked with ant plants to measure photosynthetic rates, they really get very angry and feisty. And so when I've been working with ant plants, you end up getting covered with ants that are biting you. It's really quite alarming. And so it's a really effective physical defense against browsers. but also climbing vines. If things try to climb up and use the acacia as a structural support, the ants nip those off so that there's no competition for the no competition for the acacia to have to deal with. So a great mutualism there. And a third weird one that I think is super neat, and there's this also happens with bats and pitcher plants, but here we have these beautiful Nepenthes pitchers in Borneo. We've got a tree shrew sitting on top of that pitcher. And as you know, pitcher plants are carnivorous. Those pitchers are full of water with digestive juices in them, and insects fall in and the insects get digested, and that is part of how carnivorous plants function. But these carnivorous plants also have formed these mutualisms with some different mammals, and these tree shrews are one of them. The tree shrews will come along and kind of hide out in the top of the pitcher and lick, so the pitchers have a nice nectar around the rim of the pitcher. The tree shrews will lick the nectar off, and that provides a really high energy food resource for the tree shrew. And while the tree shrew is having a little snack, it defecates into the pitcher, providing a really great source of nutrients for that pitcher plant. And bats do the same thing. Some bats will use pitcher plants as their roosting area during the day when they're resting. And while they're resting in this pitcher plant during the day, their guana will fertilize the pitcher. So all kinds of amazing other examples that are not your run-of-the-mill mycorrhizal association that might get you quite excited. Okay, so just to back up here, we talked about trophic mutualisms. Now, and in that interim slide, I talked about both some trophic mutualisms and some habitat mutualisms. And so I just want to define this idea of a habitat mutualism, where one partner provides the other with a shelter, a place to live, or a favorable habitat. And so we see that example both in the clownfish example we just talked about, the clownfish anemone example, where the anemone provides a nice protective home for that clownfish, and also in the ant-acacia relationship, where the acacia provides a home for the ants. But a great example from your text, and I hadn't heard of this one until I was reading through the text, is this amazing shrimp and goby relationship, where the shrimp digs a burrow, as you can see here, that the goby lives in with the shrimp. So they're little roommates in this burrow. And then when they leave the burrow to go feed, the shrimp is nearly blind, and so it keeps an antenna on the goby, and the goby guides it around and warns it of any dangers. And so they have this mutualistic relationship where the shrimp provides habitat for the goby, and the goby in turn provides protective warnings to the shrimp and guidance for the shrimp when the shrimp is out of the burrow. So a really neat example of a habitat mutualism. Okay, and finally, just to really quickly touch on commensalism, I'm not using as many examples because it's a much simpler kind of, the relationships are not as, A, not as intimate, and B, not as complex as we see with mutualisms. So commensalism, as a reminder, is where you have one partner in the relationship benefiting from that relationship, the other partner receiving no benefit but also no harm. And so just two really basic examples of this. One is here with this whale. You can see all of these barnacles along the chin of the whale. And that whale, those barnacles do not impact that whale in any way, shape, or form. There's no negative impact, there's no positive impact, but for the barnacles, they receive lots of benefit from attaching themselves to that whale. You can imagine being on a whale compared to being on a rock, for example. Those barnacles, A, receive a lot of protection by being on a whale. They're not going to be predated by different things that feed on barnacles. And B, they get, rather than having to rely on water currents to carry, oxygen and prey and all of the things that they need, they're on a moving fairly fast moving individual, and they get to move around from one place in the ocean to another, often being taken to productive locations. And so they can receive a lot of benefit in terms of access to resources by being attached to this mobile organism. It turns them from being a sessile organism into a mobile organism effectively. Similarly, and so it's very, very simple. There's not a complex relationship there, but you can see the clear benefits to the barnacles. Likewise, with this cute little tree frog popping its head out above this leaf, tree frogs will use all kinds of vegetation in the rainforest as protection. They hide under leaves to protect themselves from the rain during really intense rainstorms in the forest. They hide behind vegetation to protect themselves from predators. So they use the leaves and vegetation structures as part of their habitat and protection. But that leaf is neither benefited nor harmed by having that tree frog hanging out on it. And so again, another really simple example, but this sort of thing is a very common example where some vegetation, some component of the, vegetation in a community serves as, habitat, serves as cover, serves as protection of some sort, but doesn't receive any benefit or harm from the organism that's using it for those purposes. So just a couple of examples of commensalism. Okay, so we've talked about mutualism, we've talked about commensalism, we've talked about habitat mutualisms and trophic mutualisms and talked about some examples of those. Now I want to move on to talk about the kind of tightness of that relationship, the intimacy of that relationship. We already saw some pretty intimate mutualisms with plants and their fungal partners, for example, or that obligate relationship between gobies and their shrimp partners. When we think about mutualisms or commensalism, any positive biotic interaction, these can be pretty loose, so facultative, where if the species are present in the same place, they'll take advantage of that positive relationship. If not, well, that's okay. In other cases, we have obligate positive relationships. And so in this case, it's mutualisms that are essential for the survival of one or both species. Okay, so if that mutualism doesn't occur, then those species will not survive. Okay, so pretty amazing story of an obligate facultative relationship. Those fig wasps there's often a single species or a couple of species of fig wasps that pollinate the flowers of a single species of fig. Ficus, or the fig genus, is incredibly diverse, and this is the structure where the flowers are actually inside the fruit, and the only way for those flowers to get pollinated is by having the fig wasps enter the fig, as you just saw, and pollinate that fig. And so we have this really close obligate relationship. If those fig wasps disappeared, so too would the figs, because there would be no one to pollinate their flowers and they would have no seed production. So, amazing example of a really close obligate mutualism. Okay, and I wanted to show this because sometimes the nature of relationships is not always as clear as we might think. So a lot of times the term facilitation is talked about in the context of nurse plants. And here are two different examples of nurse plants. One of them is the example from your text, which is the desert ironwood. And you can see this tree here with lots of different vegetation types underneath it, some cactus, some other plant species. But what happens with these nurse plants is that they modify the environmental conditions and make the environment more favorable for other plants to grow. So these these nurse plants often occur in really harsh environments, deserts, really cold extreme environments like alpine environments. So here we have cushion plants in the Andean mountain range, and these cushion plants are often they often host a diversity of plants within their cushions. Again, they modify the microenvironment. They make it a little bit warmer. They make it a little bit moister. Maybe they make the boundary layer a little bit rougher so that it's a little more protected for those plants that are growing on the cushion. And so in that case, you could see this as being, for the most part, facultative commensalism, potentially, right? So these plants that occur under the protection of nurse plants will grow elsewhere. They just won't grow as well. So it's facultative in that sense. But I guess the question comes into whether it is facultative commensalism or whether it moves toward parasitism. Certainly the plants that grow underneath the nurse plants receive great benefit from those nurse plants. But you can, just looking at this picture, you see all of these different plants growing together in this really tight cluster, or you see these other plants like growing on top of the cushions and presumably modifying resource availability for those cushion plants or for this desert ironwood. So you could imagine it, as those plants get larger and take up more space and require more resources, that it could shift between something like facultative commensalism to something more like parasitism, where there's a benefit for, or competition, where there's a benefit for one but not the other, or there's actually damage to the other. So just another example of facilitation, certainly at the early stage, but I just wanted to highlight the idea that these relationships can also change through time or with different environmental conditions. They can be beneficial in one context but not beneficial in another context, or in fact detrimental. So Another thing I wanted to highlight is that in some cases, a mutualism can be facultative, and in other cases it can be obligate. So I have this example here of seed dispersal. So we know that trees range, or plants range, in the way that they disperse seed. For some species, the wind carries it away, and they aren't reliant at all on seed dispersers. For other species, they rely on animals and birds to carry their seeds away from the tree. And this benefits those plants. So it benefits the birds and the animals, because the birds and the animals gain resources from consuming the fruits that those seeds are in, or consuming the seeds themselves. The tree gains benefit because its offspring get to move away from the parent plant. And in a lot of contexts where you have a high density of juveniles or seeds really close to the parent plant, the risk to those individuals is higher. So there's benefit for the trees having their offspring move away from the parent plant by seed dispersers. For some species, this is a requirement. Some species need their seeds to be dispersed away from the parent plant in order for that species to survive. For other species, it's more facultative, and it's great if those seeds get dispersed away from the parent tree, but if they don't, it's going to be okay as well. So just wanted to highlight the fact that some of these relationships can be facultative in one context and obligate in another context. Okay, and we've already touched on this briefly in the context of the nurse plants, but a lot of times facilitative interactions, positive interactions, can be much, much more important when the environment is really stressful. When you have cold conditions, when you have nutrient poor conditions, when you have very dry conditions. These are situations where, you may be right on the edge of where you can survive, and some positive interaction, some facilitative interaction can help make it so that you can survive there, whereas previously that might not have been possible. Okay, and here's an example from different high and low elevation sites, and we have RNE, which is the relative neighbor effect. So this is just a relative effect of having a neighbor or not. And so a positive relative neighbor effect is where the neighbor has a positive effect on your survival, on your growth, whatever the measure is. And a negative value of this relative neighbor index is where a neighbor does not benefit you. In fact, is to your detriment. Okay, and so would be competing with you. And what we see here, so we have low and high elevation from lots of different montane regions all around the world. And what we see is that in many cases, in the low elevation regions, having a neighbor is a detriment. So you have a negative relative neighbor effect. Whereas having a neighbor at high elevations is positive, and there's this facilitative impact of having a neighbor, having a higher neighbor density at high elevations. And the reason for this is the harsher conditions. Thinking about these low elevation valley regions compared to these higher elevation regions near the vegetation limits. The conditions are much higher at higher altitudes, at higher elevations, and as a consequence, having neighbors can help ameliorate some of those stressful conditions. And we see this pretty consistently, with the exception of a few locations where neighbors have a positive impact both at low and high elevation. For the most part, we see a negative impact at low elevation of neighbors, so competition, and a positive impact at high elevations of neighbors, so facilitation. And so this is just a great example of how the environment can modify what that relationship looks like and whether it's going to have a net negative effect or a net positive effect. And just to follow along with that, as environmental conditions change, we can see these shifts from, a beneficial impact to a detrimental impact. And we have a couple of examples from your text. This is Myosotis laxa. The focal species here is Myosotis laxa. It's a wetland species. And in this experiment, it was grown with and without typha. And here we have Typha latifolia, sometimes called cattail. And what the researchers were looking at, they were measuring different growth metrics. So root length, root mass, and shoot mass. So this being the shoot mass, the root mass being all the below ground parts. And these Myosotis laxa plants were grown with and without typhus at cool temperatures and then at warm temperatures. And so we see, if we just focus on the cool temperature panel, at cool temperatures, Myosotis laxa did better when it was grown with typha, so when they were grown in mixture. And the idea was that possibly this typha species was aerating the soil. There are lots of wetland plants that are able to bring oxygen down into the soil through erenchymus tissue, so tissue that carries gases to and from the soil. And so that was the hypothesized mechanism for the improved growth of the plant at low soil temperatures. At higher soil temperatures, though, we see that Myosotis laxa actually did marginally better without typha than with typha. And so under the warmer temperatures, potentially the growth of typha increased, and it was shading out the Myosotis individuals. But we see under warm conditions, there was a negative impact. Typha acted as a competitor. Under cool conditions, typha acted as a facilitator. We see the same thing here across mean summer temperatures. Again, for some montane species where we have positive, again, this is the relative neighbor effect that we saw in the previous slide. We see positive effects of neighbors at cool temperatures, and then as the temperature warms, those impacts become negative. And so the take-home message from both of these slides is the idea that the relationship between organisms, the nature of the relationship, whether it's going to be plus, plus minus, plus neutral, can be modified by environmental conditions. And it's not as though a mutualism in one circumstance or a commensalism in one circumstance will be maintained that way throughout all conditions. And an important component of this is the idea that really mutualists are in it for themselves. There is not some kind of altruistic thing happening between individuals that are resulting in positive effects for one another. That has evolved to, you know, those mechanisms have evolved to support each of those species individually, but they're supported by having that interaction with one another. In this case, mutualism, the maintenance of mutualism requires that both partners receive a benefit from their interaction. If that benefit disappears for one or the other or becomes too weak, that mutualism will not be maintained. So this can be, in some cases, a dynamic relationship. Not in the case of obligate mutualism, but in the case of facultative mutualism, we can absolutely see changes in the way that relationship unfolds. And so a couple of examples here. One is some experimental data where we have plant roots that were supplied with labeled 14C. And so this is a tracer. We can measure that 14C. It's not the typical carbon that's in the atmosphere. We have 13C and 12C in the atmosphere. So when you label with 14C, you can figure out where it goes in the system. It's a really cool isotopic tracer. Fungal hyphae were not supplied with phosphorus, and fungal hyphae that were supplied with low or high phosphorus. Okay? And what we see is that plants transferred more of that labeled carbon to fungi that had been provided phosphorus, that were rich in phosphorus, compared to those fungi that were not. And so the plant was able to preferentially allocate resources to that partner that was going to pay it the most for the carbon. Okay, so this provides really nice evidence that plants are really in it for themselves. They're not there to make friends with the fungi. They want the resources that the fungi can provide, and they will go to the partner who can provide the most resources for them. In this case, the fungi that were supplied with elevated levels of phosphorus. Okay, and this leads us to this idea of sort of a dynamic relationship between mutualists, where, you know, in the case of this mycorrhizal mutualism, where both the plant and the fungus are benefiting, we have a mutualism. When the plant is taking too much in the way of resources from the fungus, so actually taking, you know, receiving nutrients and carbon in some cases from the fungus, it can become a parasitic relationship with the plant, taking too much from its fungal partner, where nutrients in the soil are really amply available and the plant doesn't really need the fungus for that relationship, or the fungus is drawing too much in the way of carbon for the amount of nutrients it's returning to the plant, then the positive effect for the fungus is too large relative to the effect on the plant, which starts to become negative. And so you can see that this dynamic can shift between, you know, fungal parasitism to mycorrhizal mutualism to mycoheterotrophy, which is where the plant is actually relying on the fungus for both carbon and nutrients. And so there's this whole spectrum depending on the resource exchange dynamics. And so it's really important to remember that for a mutualism to be mutualistic, we need both partners to receive net benefit. So this middle place where they're cooperating with one another rather than one exploiting the other. Okay? And so this is just another example of where these dynamics can change. So these are tree hoppers. They're little phloem feeding insects. And they have a nice mutualistic relationship with ants, where the ants provide protection to the tree hoppers from other predators. You can see these tree hoppers are incredibly apparent. And so if you're a flying insect or a bird and you see these little guys on the on a stem, they're a good thing to snack on. And so these tree hoppers need protection. The ants provide that protection, but they provide it in exchange for a secretion from the tree hoppers. So the tree hoppers secrete honeydew, which is a sugary substance that the ants feed on in return for protection from predators for the tree hoppers. Okay, so there are times though where predators are more limited, and those tree hoppers don't need that protection from predators. And so you can see a situation where that relationship could shift from a mutualism, so where both parties, both the ants and the tree hoppers, are receiving positive benefits, to something that's maybe more of a commensalism, where the tree hoppers aren't receiving benefit because there's no predators, but the ants are receiving benefit because they're still getting honeydew, or possibly even parasitism, depending on how costly it is for the tree hoppers to produce that honeydew. Okay, so you can see that depending on the context, that relationship can shift. And if those, in this situation, if those predators were absent for a number of years, then all of a sudden it starts to become, not so advantageous, or for an extended period of time, I should say, it becomes not advantageous, and it is no longer advantageous for those tree hoppers to produce honeydew for the ants. And so you can see the challenge, this balance where mutualism requires that net benefit to both party in the relationship. And of course, again, because species are in it for themselves, there's the possibility of having cheaters, where you, as a partner in a relationship, where you're supposedly cooperating in this relationship, you decide, well, I can take advantage of this and I can use this relationship to produce more offspring, and thereby, increase my chances, my fitness. So, cheaters are those individuals that increase the production of offspring by overexploiting their mutualistic partner. So if you think about that gradient that we saw between plants and fungi, where you could have cooperation or you could have exploitation on either end, this is a situation where we have an individual exploiting another individual to make additional gains. From an evolutionary perspective, this should not be supported. If both partners are not cooperating, not both receiving benefit from the partnership, then that mutualism will not be maintained. But we see lots of mutualisms being maintained. So obviously cheating is not exceptionally common. And there is some evidence that penalties can be imposed for cheaters. And here's a really fantastic example of this with the yucca and the yucca moth. Okay, and so what happens, this is a fascinating interaction. The yucca moth has this specialized mouth part. It collects pollen from one flower, one yucca flower, then it flies along, heads over to another yucca flower. It deposits its eggs into the ovary of the yucca flower, where those eggs will develop into larvae. And then it climbs up onto the style of the yucca flower and brings the pollen that it's carried in this specialized mouth part and puts it onto the style of the flower, and pollinates that flower. Now, that all sounds great. The flower is benefiting because it's being pollinated. The moth is benefiting because its eggs are being laid in the ovary where they're protected and will mature. Now, the cheating comes in when a yucca moth tries to lay too many eggs in the ovary of the plant. And what researchers have found is when for the yucca to be successful, it needs to have pollination from lots of different sources, right? It wants to bring lots of pollen from lots of different sources to increase outcrossing and genetic diversity and all of these sorts of things. And so it wants to have a number of different yucca moth visitors. But there's only so much space inside the ovary for the development of moth larvae. And so when a yucca moth cheats and tries to lay too many eggs in the ovary, the plant actually tends to abort those flowers and does not allow those ovaries to develop. And so when the number of moth eggs is below a certain limit, then we tend to have fairly high proportion of flowers retained to maturity. When an individual moth lays a high number of eggs in the ovary of a flower, then that flower tends to be aborted. And so it's a penalty for cheating. If you lay too many eggs, then you're going to lose them all. So that's just to touch on this idea of trying, ways that species may try to overexploit their partner and ways that the partner can respond. And so again, this idea of, kind of evolutionary races where one species comes up with an idea and the other species responds. We saw this in our predation and our herbivory section, and it's very similar in mutualisms. These are really intimate intimate relationships that have developed through evolutionary processes, through evolutionary time, and are constantly responding to changes by one partner or the other. Okay, so just the final slide in our lecture. I just wanted to touch on this idea that there are mutualism benefits across scales. So we often think about mutualisms as being between two individuals, individuals of two species, and certainly there are those individual benefits. Here we're back to this acacia ant-plant relationship. So here's an acacia sapling. Here's an ant. These Beltian bodies, we have nectaries at the bases of these Beltian bodies that provide food resources for the ants. We know that the ants use the thorns on the acacia as home, as a nest, as a habitat for their nest. Now, what we need to see is what is the benefit to the individual. So we know the benefits to the ant, receives these benefits. The benefit to the acacia is that both the growth and survivorship is incredibly enhanced by having ants present. So acacias that have ants grow about 14 times faster than acacias that don't have ants. That's a pretty big benefit. In addition, their survival is about double what the survival of acacias without ants. And so we have both a survival and a growth benefit of hosting these ants and providing these food resources and these habitat resources for the ants. And so this is a great benefit to the acacias. Okay, so that's at the individual level. This individual acacia will do well by supporting its partner ants. But we also see responses at kind of the community level. And so here, this is talking about a coral reef environment. We have these little cleaner fish, and what they do is they go into the mouths of larger fishes and they consume the parasites in the mouths of the fish, okay? And in fact, kind of amazingly, they will service up to 2,000 or more clients, larger fish per day. And so they do this amazing service of, removing parasites. That provides a food resource for them. It keeps the mouths of the partner fish clean. But we see this translating to increased number of species, so increased species richness within coral reefs, as well as the increase in the number of fish, so increased productivity of those systems. And so the presence of that mutualism in the system really has a large benefit. So here we have number of species, here we have number of fish, with and without cleaner fish. And so we can see that number of species is higher with cleaner fish than without, and the number of total fish in the reef habitat is much higher with cleaner fish than without cleaner fish. So we see this impact at the community level of the presence of this mutualism. And so mutualisms can have a benefits that extend beyond the individual. And then we can look at kind of more of the ecosystem scale, I guess. This is shoot biomass and root biomass and phosphate concentration of plants in an ecosystem as a function of the number of mycorrhizal species. So in this experiment, the scientists modified the number of mycorrhizal species, the potential mycorrhizal partners in the system. And what they found was that with increasing mycorrhizal species richness, we see an increase in nutrient concentrations in plant species in that ecosystem. We see increases in root biomass. We see increases in shoot biomass. So there are these positive impacts across the board of having these partners and having a greater richness of these partners in the system. And so that's just to sort of demonstrate the broader consequences of mutualisms in communities, in ecosystems, and how important these positive biotic interactions are. And with that, I will say farewell. We have student hours this evening, so I will look forward to seeing some of you there, and have a great week.